Okay, so welcome again to the INCOMPAS Policy Summit 2021. I'm Steve Augustino, and I'm pleased to have you join us. Part 2 of our panel on robocalls. Me, Mark, this is the industry panel. So thank you all for joining us, and we're very, very pleased to have you here with us today. So just before this, we completed a panel with the members of the FCC. We talked about the actions the FCC was taking with a lot of emphasis on call blocking and the call authentication or stir shaken implementation. And we learned the many, many things that the FCC is doing to try to prevent and reduce unwanted and illegal robocalls. I'm very pleased with the panel now to have members of the industry joining me, and we're going to talk about what the voice services industry itself is doing, how it's responding to these mandates, and what it is doing to again, to reach that confidence in the voice services marketplace. So in this panel, we're going to talk about what's being done, what more needs to be done, and how we manage all of this change that the FCC and the robocalling industry is throwing at folks. I am pleased to be joined today by Gunnar Halley, who is Assistant General Counsel at Microsoft, Sheba Chacko, Chief Regulatory Counsel at BT. Sheba, thanks for joining us. And Greg Rogers, Head of Global Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Bandwidth. We have a terrific group with you today. Thanks everybody for joining. Again, if you're a participant and you have questions, please use the Q&A function. Put those questions out there. We will do our best to answer them in the time that we have allotted. There's a lot to talk about, so we're going to dive right in. Greg, you and I were on a panel a year ago, also talking about robocalls and what was being done at that point. So I'm going to start asking you the same question I asked then. How has the proliferation of robocalls impacted your business? And what are some of the major steps your company's taken to mitigate the problem these days?
Thanks, Steve. Yep, so it was just about a year ago, right, that we were in person, and that was the last event that I attended in person. And here we are doing it again a year later virtually. But, you know, I think it's a very broad question about how it's impacted our business. I would tell you that, you know, our business ends up, we're focused on addressing it because we suffer a lot of the ills, even though we're in the intermediate space. We still have customers that we need to be working with to manage, to protect them and their services and advance their services. Robocalling becomes, you know, a major operational challenge for us. It also can present, you know, significant network architecture and network capacity management problems. It's not something that represents a great margin opportunity for us. It's not traffic we want. We really want to be able to support traffic on behalf of customers that are sending things that people want and not chasing down, you know, all the bad guys and, you know, playing whack-a-mole with a bunch of telephone numbers and all of that. So it you know, it has a significant negative impact on our business that we're, you know, we've been interested in and are actively interested in trying to mitigate and reduce to the greatest degree possible. You know, so over the last year, what have we done? I would say stir shaken is really kind of at the forefront of what we've been able to do in implementing it, adopting it, implementing it, and then having successful interoperability sessions with major carriers. And we were one of the 7 providers at the end of the year that was deemed eligible or was granted an exemption of the compliance date in advance. So, you know, we've done a lot of work with stir shaken in addition to a lot of the other robocall mitigation efforts too.
Okay, all right. And I'm going to turn Gunnar to you and Sheba if you want to weigh in as well. So, you know, as we heard on the earlier panel, there's been a lot of change directed by the FCC, call blocking requirements or options, at least in that realm, redress options, the stir shaken implementation, robocall mitigation plans, quite a lot there. How do you approach that change? Like what kind of impact does change itself have on the business of providing telecommunications?
I think flexibility is the key word here. There's a lot of new opportunities and requirements, and we completely share in the goal here of being able to get ahead of illegal and unwanted robocalls. And at the same time, we've been a tad concerned about the pace of and magnitude of all of the change. And it comes from a good place. And you have to start somewhere. So we've started. But I think what we're preparing for is a bit of turbulence, inadvertent turbulence, sort of unexpected or unanticipated consequences of sort of the confluence of all of these new requirements, inadvertent blocking, potentially redress mechanisms that aren't adequate, different parts of the ecosystem implementing shaken in different ways or at different times, creating some sort of bumps in the road. So I think we just all have to realize we're working towards, hopefully, the same good goal here. And we need to be working together, cooperatively, have some understanding, and be able to respond quickly as needed. And as part of that, I think the FCC will be an important partner when we do need some industry-wide guidance or direction. Their willingness to provide that will be important as well. But Steve, I think, you know, for us, we've got a lot of people working on things diligently. It's a lot of work. And I know that other companies are in the same boat. And I go back to my original statement, which is it's all about flexibility. I think we're just going to have to take this as it comes and hope that any sort of bump in the road is resolved as quickly as possible.
Steve, I agree. Second, what Gunnar has just said. For BT, I would add that, well, I think this is true for all providers. It's added a huge element of uncertainty. One of the most consistent questions I get is, well, what does this mean? What percentage is going to be blocked? How is this going to lead to more disputes? What's going to happen? And the answer is we'll have to wait and see. We just don't know. There's a lot that the Commission is trying to achieve by the deadlines. Its efforts are heroic. The goals are noble, but it doesn't all necessarily hang together neatly and tightly. So we are expecting, as Gunnar says, bumps in the road.
Okay, all right, and I'm gonna jump right on one of those bumps. But we talked briefly in the earlier session about the robocall mitigation program and that filing requirement. We didn't fully flesh it out there, and so I'll add that part of the requirement that service providers file this certification in this robocall mitigation program is that that's going to be enforced by the industry later, in that downstream providers are not to be receiving traffic from those parties who didn't file a certification. Now, the FCC doesn't require foreign providers to file a certification, but it has a rule that will enable them to, and at least this prohibition part, it hasn't changed, hasn't backed away from that. So I know that's on reconsideration, but let's start right there with sort of, possibly some of the unintended consequences of that particular rule and where it stands. So can you explain a little bit about what difficulties that rule is presenting?
Sure. So the rule requires, it does not require foreign providers to register in the database, the Robocall Mitigation database, unless they are, quote unquote, using US telephone numbers. And right there, it is unclear what exactly using US telephone numbers means. And we will have a situation where industry participants are going to interpret that phrase differently. There is no clarity and guidance. US industry participants will not be allowed to terminate the traffic of foreign voice providers who don't register in the database if those foreign voice providers are, quote unquote, using US telephone numbers. And they will have to check for the adequacy of the certifications in the database. Again, that's an element of uncertainty. What exactly are they checking for? And industry participants are going to interpret this requirement differently. There seem to be a whole variety of opportunities for the blocking of foreign originated traffic. I think one, what the Vaughan petition and the CTIA petition have highlighted are the instances of the roaming situation where you've got US mobile users traveling in another country and calling back to the United States. The providers, the foreign providers will, quote unquote, be using US numbers. Most of them, I do not expect, have any idea about the registration requirement. So that seems to be yet another avenue for the blocking of legitimate traffic. So yes, there seems to be a lot of uncertainty, and hopefully this is an area that the Commission grabs a hold of and adds more clarity to.
Right. And tries to ensure that we're not harming legitimate foreign calls.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So let's also talk about some of the implementation issues dealing with stir shaken, and specifically, I want to talk about the ability of the originating carrier to put authentication information into the call stream. Now, in order to do that, you have to have token authority. You have to be able to actually provide that authentication information. Currently, as I discussed a little bit in the earlier part of this, the industry rules require access to numbers to do that, but that's changing. And I want to get your reaction to the changes and the benefits that that's going to have on the ability to get meaningful authentication information into the outbound call stream. So Gunnar or Greg, I don't know who wants to take this first, but your thoughts on the ability to get access the tokens and removing that access to number requirement.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in real quick. I don't want to prevent Greg from speaking either. So I think the STIGA's decision to expand token eligibility was welcome. It was forward thinking. It was sort of the right move to align token access with the legal obligation to implement shake-in or a call authentication system. And it allows the entity that really has that closest relationship with the customer and who can authenticate the customer actually perform that authentication. So it makes a lot of practical sense. So we think it's a really good move. We're delighted to see it. It doesn't foreclose others from still getting direct access to numbers and using that as a mechanism, but it does broaden eligibility. And Microsoft yesterday, along with RingCentral, filed and 8x8 filed a petition with the CRTC in Canada to ask them to have the CSTGA do a similar thing to broaden eligibility for tokens in Canada as they implement Shaken, just because saying there's no technical barrier, and I think the American experience is sort of paving the way and showing that broader Shaken ecosystem will facilitate more implementation and hopefully allow us to reduce illegal spoofing and unlawful spoofing.
I might just jump in quickly and say that I think it was maybe one of the early
Oh,
instances.
Greg, I think you're on mute unless I can't.
Can you hear me?
Can others hear him?
Okay, I thought I was unmuted, but the turbulence, the bumps in the road that we're referring to, where it caused everyone to sort of see what was happening a little bit, where there was a lot of confusion, I think, in the industry, that it was a requirement that people felt they needed to go and meet, whether or not they necessarily qualified, right, as an interconnected VoIP provider, or even wanted numbers. They felt perhaps that they had to do it just because it was a requirement. And if the objective really was to allow people to sign their originating traffic, then you could do it perhaps in a more streamlined fashion and not have this direct access to numbers requirement that was the source of a lot of confusion for a lot of industry participants. And I think it's still playing itself out, frankly. Once we kind of went in that direction, it's hard to shift course and kind of get back to, okay, well, what is it we're really trying to accomplish? Is it really that you're looking to be able to obtain your tokens and sign your traffic to try to ensure that you're representing your originating traffic, to the fullest degree as you can to support it, right, in downstream treatments? And I think, again, I echo Gunnar's sentiments that it's a move in the right direction, and hopefully it will sort of alleviate some of the confusion that's been there and help us move forward and tackle some of these other aspects of everything that we're working on too.
Right, okay. And sort of a related question. First of all, I want to remind our participants, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box. We will do our best to address those questions. But the other aspect of putting that authentication information in there is that obviously the relationships among carriers, the relationships between carriers and their enterprise customers, they're all very, very complex, and there's multiple layers to it. So what are some of the things that are being done, or what are some of the concerns in making sure that we're getting the most accurate authentication information possible? Like, how do you manage those kinds of relationships to have the best information out there?
It's a tough one. I'll just jump in quickly and say that I think, again, we're going to have to sort our way through some of that, because there are, wide-ranging business models, wide-ranging use cases that may not necessarily be, exactly what the, receiving party's business model and use case is. And so you're going to need to be able to kind of figure out, how you exchange your traffic and across, the core of the network too. So there are so many different players involved. There's so many different consumer scenarios involved to make a decision about whether traffic is illegal, whether it's wanted, whether it's proper or improper. And then what do you do about it? The operational management, network management is certainly a major challenge, and requires a lot of that intercarrier cooperation to some of Gunnar's original comments, that everyone's got to be willing to kind of work together and cooperate to achieve, the outcomes of cleaning up the ecosystem ultimately.
Others, what can you do to make sure that your calls, as you're originating them, or your customers' calls, are being, authenticated in the proper manner?
Cross your fingers. No, I'm kidding. I think one of the things that we're doing is beefing up our, to the extent that there are opportunities to do so, are sort of know your customer opportunities, so that we have more information about the people that are originating calls on, or enterprises that are originating calls on our networks. Participating in, as Greg said, sort of multi-provider organizations and efforts, so that to the extent that there are questions, we can answer them quickly. To find out that there are problems, we'd like to find out if there are problems quickly. So for us, using SIP response codes are great, right? Because we can find out if our calls are being inordinately blocked for some reason. And it may be that was inadvertent or wrongfully blocked. It may be that they were rightfully blocked. We have a bad actor on our system, but either way, getting that feedback through at a network level immediately is really helpful to us. So we're advocating, so we're trying to build up our know your customer capabilities. We're working with other carriers, and we are advocating for and implementing SIP response codes.
Yeah, it's a huge, there are a huge amount of unknowns with this. We are, appreciate the commercial flexibility that the commission is giving providers. We are, there's a translation element, even though BT, we are dealing with English speakers in the UK and elsewhere. There is a level of surprise. There's a lot coming out of the commission, a lot for teams globally to digest and compute. And there is some surprise, there is some amazement. Basically doing the best we can, we're to make sure that we have processes and procedures and can cooperate with US providers to, whether it's on the enforcement front or with respect to know your customer, or traceback, or conveying the authentication, good sound authentication information.
Right. Okay, good. So let's talk about, I want to next talk to the group about IP interconnection. So we know that the call authentication system, the STIR/SHAKEN, only works in IP portions of networks. And there's a deadline for IP portions. There's an extension for the non-IP portions of the network, but it does come with some conditions in terms of robocall mitigation, et cetera. So I think some had hoped that this might lead to greater incentives for IP interconnection, and maybe, finally getting us to that point of ubiquitous or near ubiquitous IP interconnection. So, is that something that we're starting to see? Do we see that people are moving towards converting to IP as an easier way of implementing these requirements?
So you can mark me down for someone who has been hopeful, Steve. But I think ubiquitous is a big word, and maybe not very realistic. But I think, you've got to get the momentum going in that direction and get as much adoption as you can. And the marketplace, ultimately will dictate that shift, where you're able to support STIR/SHAKEN, but you're also able to support rich call data that people are going to want and become accustomed to using and seeing. So there's a lot of market-driven reasons why IP interconnection, I think, once momentum builds, will take hold. one of the challenges that we see and have is that there remains this intercarrier comp regime that's out there that is so TDM focused that people will maximize to the greatest degree possible. And you get all kinds of gamesmanship in the intercarrier comp space. And so, not to make it even more complex than it already is, but that absolutely is part of what's going on as we work to evolve toward IP interconnection, and hopefully the commission can help prod that along as much as possible.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, let me move on then to talk a little bit about Traceback and the Traceback activities. That is another feature of the anti-robocall activities the FCC has moved in place. The Traceback did create a formal place in the industry for what had been an informal industry activity. So now it's been designated formally by the FCC. And as one of the FCC individuals noted, that one of the only clear prescriptions for carriers for anti-robocall activity is that they respond to traceback requests. So what are your thoughts about the traceback process, or give me a little bit of how you're seeing that going, or how you hope to see that move forward?
Greg, do you want to go first, or do you want?
Go ahead. You sounded like you were going to jump in there.
Oh, we have been trying to implement it. We've had conversations with the Traceback group. We do have concerns. Broadly speaking, we agree. It's a good idea. There seem to be a number of aspects that are sound, but by the same token, we do have concerns about other aspects of it, including whether or not there are the controls and around data protection and privacy issues, especially when we're dealing with privacy laws of other countries. When you cast it as a trade association that is seeking information, personal data about individuals in another country, we cannot be put in a situation where we are in violation of local laws because we're trying to comply with the Traceback group's requests. That said, my sense from just talking to certain industry participants who've dealt with the Traceback process is that the ITG has been accommodating and understanding in trying to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just here, we've touched on this, the registration of foreign service providers, and I think that's driven with some of the challenges where you can do traceback to a point, but if calls are being originated in a foreign location, the enforcement becomes really difficult, whether that's commercial enforcement or enforcement, by US law enforcement agencies. So I think that's where people say, okay, we'll force foreign service providers to register in our system too. And jurisdictionally, that presents, some legal questions, if not nothing else. And then I think too, you're also confronting privacy laws that, are potentially in direct conflict, right, with the idea that carriers will self-enforce, they'll share information with one another, for the purpose of trying to stop bad actors, but you likely reach a point somewhere in the service chain where you confront that privacy set of issues. And you just have to appreciate that that's the, that's the legal construct in which we're operating, which probably then says, okay, at that point, you're going to need some formal enforcement. If you've got enough information to go on, you need formal enforcement, not sort of commercial information sharing in a loose fashion.
Okay. And one aspect we haven't talked on, which, maybe it's just because we haven't really seen it yet, is that a lot of the purpose of this traceback process is to give the Enforcement Bureau the ability, the information it needs to identify potential individual bad actors or sources of those calls. And the new rules have this provision in there contemplating that the Enforcement Bureau will send notifications then to individual carriers saying, you've got a problem, do something about it. And if you guys, I think that's yet to be seen. And I think that that's yet another thing to, for the industry really to have to think about. How is it that you're going to handle those? What's that volume really going to look like when we get there? And I don't know that anybody has an answer to those questions at this point. But I just
No, I think that's some of the fun ahead, probably. I mean, you hope that all works the way it's intended, and it doesn't. But I think it's one of the areas of concern and confusion and consternation that we're all trying to manage as all of this is getting rolled out and quickly.
Right. Okay. All right. So let me ask you about shifting then to the call redress situation. And we talked a little bit about this, but I want to go back to that and get your all's perspective on what the FCC has done. And it's particularly in its December 30th order. It struck a balance, which our FCC panelists spent some time talking about what that balance was and where that would be, to deal with claims of erroneous blocking and how those would be responded to by the carriers that are performing the blocking. And I just want to get your viewpoints on those activities, sort of how the FCC has addressed that. Do you see what they're doing as a good thing? Are we moving in the right direction here?
Gunnar, you want to jump in on that one first?
Sure. I do like the balance between the SIP response code and the blocking. And I've heard from folks in industry that the time that they need a little bit more time to get the SIP response codes in place. There are some questions about that. Those are fair concerns. But I think at sort of the high level, pairing increased blocking with an increased sort of feedback mechanism is a good strategy and one that we would support because it lets you. I'll tell you what we're really worried about is a bunch of legitimate calls getting blocked, and for over a century, this telecommunications network has been based upon no blocking. We were, common carriers are sort of their brethren, and we completed all calls. Even if you had disputes about, access charges, you completed the calls and you resolved those disputes on the side. We're seeing a fundamental change in approach to operating the public switch telephone network. It's fundamentally different than we've ever done it before. I personally think we've been a little over enthusiastic about the blocking, but I'm only one person. But I think everybody can share the view that nobody wants legitimate calls being blocked. That's a failure, right? Then the network's not working properly. And so when the commission actually implements mechanisms for redress to stop that to undo sort of inadvertent or mistaken blocking, I think that's a good thing. And the goal really that we all need to keep our eyes on the goal is that we're trying to make sure that legitimate calls are not being blocked. And if they are, we get that problem taken care of as quickly as possible so that our remedy for illegal robocalls isn't sort of destroying the proper functioning of the public switch telephone network.
Yeah, I mean, like Gunnar, BT is glad to see that there are that the mechanism is a little less lopsided now. There is some redress mechanism and some notification to the caller that the caller is blocked. That said, I think Jerusha had mentioned that certain carriers were touting the fact that 1.5 billion calls had been blocked, or in another case, tens of millions of calls were blocked by a mobile carrier. So on the provider that's originating calls, I suppose one question mark is what volume of these codes is one going to see? Is one going to see half a million 607 codes and 608 codes? Okay, what does one do with that volume of codes? So yes, it's progress, glad to see it, but now we've got to figure out what to do with it.
I think too, I might just sort of reiterate some of the comments I started out with, which are that, there's such a wide range of use cases out there, and you're putting some of these judgment calls in people's hands to make a determination on blocking. And, redress becomes super important for that reason, that you have an opportunity, you have an avenue to figure out that something has gone awry, and let's get it fixed. And we can explain to you why it's appropriate. But, one example that we've seen and, are actively trying to work our way through is what is a, wanted spoofing instance, right? People like to take their mobile number and incorporate it into IP-enabled voice calling services. I mean, it's just super common. But we've seen that wireless carriers didn't anticipate that. They don't really know about that use case to the degree that we do on our side of the equation. And they've got treatments in place that say, well, that's spoofing. That's inappropriate spoofing. We're going to block that. So, that's a good example, I think, where, we're in the midst of trying to go through redress, right, if you will, and prevent wanted services and wanted calling from being mistakenly blocked, to the greatest degree possible.
Okay, and one of our commenters had a question on this, and so I was going to ask you sort of just kind of how you think things are going. Are we making progress? But the comment points up, I think, an even deeper and broader question here regarding the public switch network. Are we seeing a fundamental shift in attitudes towards voice calling? I guess is this something that can be saved? I talked a little bit about providing confidence again in voice calling. Have we moved beyond that? Like a caller's looking for something different, maybe calling them on a set of contacts really, and not with the world generally.
I'd be interested in responding to that, actually. I think it's a great question, right? And first of all, I'm hopeful. The optimist in me tells me that Shaken just on its own can help with that, right? And Shaken doesn't say if it's a bad caller or a good caller, but it does say that the caller, like, we know whether or not the caller had the right to use that telephone number, or at least if they do, we can tell the called party that the person calling had the right to use that telephone number. The fancier we get with more analytics, the more apt we are towards error. So we have to be careful there. But I do hope that we can, to the extent that we all started to rely on caller ID, that we can restore some faith in caller ID a little bit. I'll caution on the other side that if you keep trying to make a phone call and it won't get through or it gets blocked, at some point you're going to pick it up and you're just going to Skype instead of using the phone network, or you're going to use iMessage and you're going to skip over the PSTN entirely because we've over-indexed on blocking, right? So like we've got to make sure that we get this right and we don't actually cause more harm than the harm that was already being imposed. And that's been our goal. But I will say, you know, if you look at email, which we've talked about in sort of industry fora as another example, you get a lot of spam, but there's a lot of spam control. You do get email from people that you don't know, and sometimes it's welcomed and sometimes it's not. And we're, as consumers or recipients of phone calls, hopefully we'll have more tools to be a little bit more sophisticated about how we filter and receive those calls. I don't think the PSTN's dead. I hope it's not.
There's a lot in there. Gunnar, I was just, it seems to me like one of the things that for those of us that are in the space, you know, may sometimes lose sight of, you know, the big picture, who uses the PSTN and why. And I think, you know, the COVID pandemic is one instance where people all of a sudden rediscovered, you know, but platforms of calling into conference bridges, right, it became far more common than it was previously. And, you know, we had to increase our capacity to support those kinds of services dramatically as a result. But another one that we are very much, you know, as part of our business is emergency calling, right? And so when you talk about, you know, who wants and needs and uses the PSTN, I really do think you have to think about consumer protection oriented things like 911 calling, and try to ensure that you've got a fully functional, you know, operational to the greatest degree PSTN that people can use when they want to or need to.
I will say, like, to build on that, the PSTN is the ultimate interoperable like network, right? I mean, you hear in Europe a lot of talk about interoperability among apps, for example, but the PSTN, it's, you know, I guess email is this way too, but it allows sort of different providers and different networks to communicate on a standards basis. So you know you can reach somebody. It's that interoperability, that universal ability to reach, that's valuable. So, you know, if we can get rid of the mess of these illegally spoofed calls and unwanted robocalls, it at its core, it's still a very valuable function.
You know, a part of me listening to Gunnar and Greg thinks I look at my teenage sons and their friends. They're not inclined to pick up the phone and call people, except when they're gaming with their circle of friends, or they're with their closed user group of known, you know, known persons and unknown persons, but it's a closed user group. And, you know, I don't know if that is, that's really the future of voice calling, whether you end up calling within your network, and that's that.
Yeah. It's interesting questions, but I think everybody feels that these illegal robocalls are an impediment to whatever value we see in the PSTN, and so we're making progress there. I want to thank you all for joining us. I give you a chance. We all got a minute or two, so you know, 45 seconds each if you want to add anything about sort of where we are, what we should be talking about robocalls next year. You know, any other sort of closing remarks on this topic?
I will throw one thought out, which is the commission again has done so much heroic effort. I think it has used or implemented so many measures in its toolkit. I don't think it needs to race. I think it needs to sit back now and take a little time, to the extent it can, and see how things are settling in and which measures actually end up being the most effective.
Okay. Any other closing thoughts?
I agree with that, Sheba. I think that's a great, let's be mindful. We've been very, very fast. We've been sprinting. Now let's see how this all shakes out and focus on refining into a V2 that works a little more smoothly.
And I'll echo a lot of that and say, Steve, hopefully we can do it again in person next year. And I will say, I think we will need to do it again because we've been sprinting, but I would tell you, I think it's a marathon. You know, there isn't a silver bullet, you know, to Sheba's comments, like some of these things are going to work and pay dividends to a greater degree than other things. And having an opportunity to kind of digest what's working well and what's perhaps not working so well. But, you know, it's going to take a long time for the industry as a whole to digest and incorporate all of this. So again, I think we'll be talking about it next year and for years to come.
Excellent. Okay. Well, listen, I want to thank all of you for joining us. It's been a very interesting panel. You've got a lot of experience. It's been very helpful to everybody on board here. I want to thank everybody who has joined the INCOMPAS Summit for joining us. We appreciate it. We hope you have a really good day and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.